This story originates in a beautiful but still cold month like February. It was then that the girl in question was graduating from the academy, and she was ready to take the examination to become a civil servant. However, things didn't happen the way she expected or wanted. The girl's name was Satya, and all her dreams came crashing down one day. Then they came to her and told her it was time for her family to repay her for raising her. The reality was that she was to be sold as a concubine for King Muvia. Her family continued to serve as knights to Count Halogen, and to do all his bidding. To put it another way, her family's title is not hereditary. And for families like hers, there are only two options to maintain status. They must either distinguish themselves in battle, where they will show their bravest side, or find favor with the noble family they serve. Satya's father chose to do the latter. He groveled to keep his knighthood. The girl for this hated him with all her heart. He accumulated debts, trying to gain the favor of the dignitaries of society. Satya was then able to win a scholarship and worked part-time to pay for a room at the institution. And at the same time, her family continued to spend money they essentially didn't have. And just like that, their debts grew like a huge snow globe, piling up more and more. Eventually, the girl's family decided to sell her to the harem to pay off these huge debts. And so a few years later, Satya was at the employment agency. In fact, the girl wanted nothing more than to repay her family for selling her out. But she was completely out of ideas. Where to get that money? Then she sighed heavily and realized that this day looked like a failure as well. But at that moment, a man came into the agency. He was covered with a hood, so it was impossible to see his face, but the girl was very interested. He was accompanied by two workers, and they began to go upstairs. Satya suggested that he might be some kind of hunter, because he was dressed very casually. The girl continued to sit or stand her magazine, and around her some of the workers were running back and forth, bringing something upstairs. And so after a while, Satya's partner, who was sitting nearby, approached her and told her she had a job. The girl was surprised and thought, maybe she means the man who went up just a little while ago? But her partner said she could go upstairs to the manager's office. Satya pondered this suggestion for a while. Then she said she would do it. And so the girl got up from her desk. When she got up, there was a guard at the entrance. He had already opened the door for her and wanted to let her through. Satya said nothing to him, not even looking at him, walking straight into the room. As soon as she walked in, she immediately looked around at the eyes. A man who sat in the middle of the room caught her eye. She didn't know who it was, and she couldn't figure out where she'd seen it before. Then she began to look at him carefully. After a while, Satya realized who it was. But at that moment, one of the assistants came up to him. They started talking about something. Then he waved his head at them and told them they could leave. The guy had blonde hair and glasses through which it was impossible to see his eyes. Satya realized that without the hat, she could recognize him. It was Mil Lunaria. He had been at the academy a year earlier than she had, and was able to become famous for having the worst results in his class. He scored 0 on all his exams, and also failed all subjects because he forgot to turn in papers on time, so he also got bad grades. Unlike his glamorous peers, he always wore a rough leather jacket, and he walked like that from head to toe, even on the hottest summer days. His uniform was always too loose, and his straw hat was shredded into small pieces, even peeping through holes in some places. Despite being a nobleman, Mil was very fond of tending the garden. He even sometimes said he had a green thumb or something. And after all that, the girl couldn't believe that the person who was notorious was Mil Lunaria. Took her and hired her as an employee. The girl still couldn't believe it, so she asked again. Mil smiled cheerfully and said that was correct. Satya took another look at him and couldn't believe that this was her new boss. After a while, the guy told her to have a seat and that he had heard that she was in dire need of money. Satya walked over to the couch that was next to the chair the man was sitting in and said, "Surprised that news travels fast after all." At that moment, Mil picked up some papers in his hands and said that he would look at them now. After a while of studying them, he said that she specialized in public administration and was even a major. He also said she was studying business, real estate, and after that he asked if that was true. Satya nodded and said that it was all true. Then he put the papers aside and slowly asked what exactly she knew about him. The girl noticed that his voice was very short, and that meant he lacked confidence. Setia, however, answered his question by saying that she knew a little about him and called him her lord. Emil objected and said he was quite sure she knew enough, and added that he had too much money on his hands. When the girl heard that, she thought it was good that he had money, and afterwards she said that he was also a count. The man, hearing this, smiled happily and said that indeed it was so. Emil suggested getting to the point. He said he needed someone competent around him because, as she probably already knew, he wasn't very smart. Setia ignored his words and asked what exactly he wanted her to fulfill. He thought for a moment, and then, looking at the girl, replied that he would like her to manage his precious family's property. The girl started to say whether it meant that, but then broke off at the phrase, thinking that he probably needed a professional assistant. Setia decided that she could handle it quite well. However, Emil interrupted her and said that he needed her as a wife. The girl, who hadn't fully heard his words because she was still in her own thoughts, didn't understand anything at first. But here, after a while, when she analyzed what he wanted, she was surprised. Setia stammered to rephrase what he had just said because she still couldn't believe what he said. In fact, despite the fact that he's and Earl, Emil Lunaria is the worst husband you can think of. She's sure that being Countess Lunaria is much better than being sold into the harem, but she hates fools and just can't marry the Count. But seeing her frightened look, Emil said that of course it would be an arranged marriage and no commitment. Setia sighed heavily and said that she could certainly understand that. She then added, asking, wouldn't he need a real wife at some point? So why does he need this sham marriage? She doesn't understand. Emil didn't answer anything. He just sat and listened to the girl with a stone face. He was no longer so happy. But then, Setia nonchalantly replied that of course she knew he was at the age to settle down and start a family, and she was sure he had plans to have children of his own. Then the guy turned away from her and, embarrassed, said that he wasn't going to have kids. After a little silence, he replied that for personal reasons. The girl realized that she had violated personal boundaries a bit, so she simply replied that she understood, and then I wondered if he was infertile by any chance. She looked at him in surprise. Emil, noticing this, said he really hoped she wasn't thinking what he thought she was thinking. Well then, the girl asked, what about his heir? The man replied that he was going to bequeath his property to the child of the first prince. Setia thought about it and realized that it made sense after all. The first prince was his cousin, and the late queen was from the Lunaria family. Then he put the cup on the table and said that what he needed now was not a wife, but a business partner, and he thought the girl was perfect for the role. She also immediately asked, and how long will this sham marriage last? Emil replied that it would last about 4 years, for he thought that should be more than enough. Then she asked, and what would her monthly pay be? The fellow immediately replied that it would be 10 million ling. Setia, hearing this, couldn't believe the truthfulness of such words, for her salary for being just an assistant to be as much as that. After all, that's about 3 times the salary of the average civil servant, and she will also be provided with room and board 24 hours a day. Emil added, also that if she succeeded in fulfilling their contract, he would add another 500 million lin as severance pay. The girl started to resist. With herself, she didn't want to let money go to her head. The guy just sat there smiling, waiting for her answer. But seeing that she could not make up her mind, rising from her chair, replied that he was not asking her to answer immediately. She could think it over and let him know when she came to any decision. As Setia stood up and they began to walk towards the exit, she said she would give him an answer, of course. But at that moment he stopped and said that Lunaria Manor was very famous for its beautiful roses. Setia was surprised and asked what he was talking about. Emil said that roses begin to bloom in late spring and bloom in early summer. He then took some kind of envelope out of his pocket and, holding it out to the girl, said that he hoped they would enjoy them together. Setia hadn't expected this, but of course she took the envelope and just stood there looking at it. She thought for a while after that, and Emil had already gone outside and gotten into her wagon to ride back to her place. Then the girl ran out of the building and turned to the gentleman. She ran over to his window and said roses. She would love to see them bloom with him. Emil was a little surprised that the girl had made up her mind so quickly, and also caught up with him. But then he smiled and said he would look forward to it, calling her his lady. After their conversation, the girl arrived at Lunarius Manor. She sat in the reception area and began to sign various documents. Satya took a quill in her hand and said that they would probably start with the happiness of the monetary compensation of the contract. Then she began to put everything down on paper, saying at the same time that the monthly payment is 10 million and 120 million lin as an advance. The severance pay will be 500 million lin. Meal was also writing it all down on his piece of paper in parallel. The girl also said that the payment would be tripled if the contract was broken. When they had written all this up, Satya offered to go into the details of the contract and asked if he had any requests. The man thought for a moment and afterwards said that they should probably fulfill their marital duties. The girl immediately began to write it down. Meal explained that he just wants them to look like a couple in love, and that includes eating meals together. And afterward he added that there should be no cheating on either side. He didn't want them to damage the reputation of both families. Satya hesitated at this point before writing down the rules. Then the man looked at her in surprise, and afterward asked if she happened to have a lover, his voice confident and even a little angry. Satya was surprised at such a question, but quickly said that she had no one. Then the boy became kinder. He smiled, and said he was quite happy to hear that, and also that she should be sure to include the part about admiring rose blossoms together. The girl was surprised by this. She asked if he wanted to include it in the official contract, but Meal replied that of course it must be done. After all, they had promised to look at it together, and here was a man of his word. Satya was a little embarrassed, but replied that she would put that clause in the contract. Well, the man still wouldn't settle down, and said that when the roses started to bloom, he'd like to have afternoon tea in the garden twice a week. The girl was outraged by this. She interjected and said she must be joking to say such a thing. But Meal didn't understand why she was so angry and was even a little confused. Then apparently he was completely serious in his words. So Satya lowered her head and apologized, saying it was just her bad joke. The guy was surprised and said he didn't know she had it in her nature. But then the girl added that after all, so many times the tea party was too much. Meal agreed if and said that in that case they could have tea twice a week, only when the roses were in full bloom. After a while they finally finished writing their contracts. The guy and the girl still discussed a lot of things to make sure everything was clear and straightforward. When they had finished, Meal, rising from the table, turned to the girl and told her that she could have the wedding of her dreams. Satya took her papers and said that in that case, she wanted to skip the ceremony, because it wouldn't be wise to just waste money. Meal wasn't going to pressure the girl, so he said that if that was what she really wanted, then so be it. Satya thought for a while, and when the guy was about to leave the room, she said that if he was asked about it. Then she asks him to say that she broke off her relationship with our family and didn't want to have a proper ceremony. Emil objected and said that no. They would say they missed out because the groom had no one to invite to the wedding. And then he turned around and started walking away. The girl was surprised and asked how that could be, but he quickly ran out of the room and said he had to get on with the garden. Satya was a little shocked, but then realized that it wasn't like they were competing to see who had the fewest acquaintances to invite to a fake wedding. But at that moment her thoughts were interrupted by a voice. It was a boy. He looked out from around the corner and addressed her. Satya was surprised but asked what was the matter. The boy replied that he just wanted to tell her, and after that he added that since they had decided to go without formalities, the day had already arrived when their first wedding night was coming. When evening came, they came to the bedroom, where a huge bed made for 2 people was already waiting for them. Meal, after watching for a while, walked over to a couch that stood nearby and said he would sleep there. When he was about to lie down, his shirt unbuttoned a little and the girl saw his pumped and muscular chest. But Satya interrupted herself before these thoughts and said to herself to keep herself under control. After all, this wasn't a real wedding night for them. So she turned to him and said that she might well sleep on the couch. Meal replied that a husband of sound mind would not allow his wife to sleep on the couch. But the girl said he was quite tall, so he would be a little uncomfortable sleeping on such a small couch. The man was shocked. He asked, "And what should they do in such a situation?" Satya still couldn't believe that she had immodest thoughts about this man. Then she remembered that when they first met, he had said he couldn't have children, and she figured he couldn't fulfill his marital duty either, including. Setia pointed her finger at the bed and said it was big enough for the two of them. She suggested that they sleep on opposite sides this day, and that they ask for a curtain to divide the bed in half for the next day. Emil was genuinely surprised. He said he had never thought of such a thing. Then he moved closer to her, and added that she was so clever, calling her his mistress. Setia wasn't used to having someone to compliment her, so she shyly said she wasn't that smart. Then there was an awkward silence between them. But after that, each went off to do his business before going to bed. And so, when the moon and the stars in the sky were already showing, they started to go to bed. The boy and the girl were very uncomfortable about it. When Setia was already in bed before she fell asleep, she pondered everything that had happened to her, the words of her father, who had yelled at her, and the way her now real husband told her he needed someone like her and hoped they could enjoy life together. She looked at him and thought that Count Lunaria had asked for her help instead of taking advantage of her desperate situation. Apparently, he really does need her as much as he says he does. Gaining courage, the girl said in a muffled voice that he might not be as kind to her as he was now. After all, he was her boss. Emil just lay silent for a while, staring at the ceiling. Afterward he said, "Okay, if that's what she wanted." Hours later, Setia slept peacefully on her side of the bed and had various dreams. Emil woke up at this time and looked at the girl sleeping next to him and smiled. At dawn, the fellow went to his office to settle some business. He was with his assistant and asked him what the duty was after all. The guy with blue hair replied that the debt was 3 billion lin, and he added that her family was up to something. They were trying to blame Mrs. Poyne for everything. The man was surprised and asked what blame meant. But the guy responded that one thing it did mean was that they were trying to make it look like it was her fault. After that, he showed a few lines from the girl's family in color, such as, "How dare she do this to us? We're her family, or how dare she sue us? That ungrateful idiot." Karen, that was the deputy's name. He asked if he liked it, since he wasn't as good an actor as Emil, but it still came out well. My lord didn't answer anything to that. He just looked at his aide and began tapping his fingers on the table. Karen couldn't believe that he had started tapping his fingers again, which meant he was most likely plotting to do something terrible to that family. Then he decided to say that it was worth adding that they were still Mrs. Poyne's family after all. Emil then stopped tapping his fingers and said that he was contemplating punishment for them, but that didn't mean he would actually do it at all. Karen said that of course he wouldn't do that. Then the master asked him to take care of them as usual. The boy said he would do as instructed, but before he left, he added that he had one more question. However, Emil indifferently told him to leave. Karen was surprised and asked if he was sure. After all, he wants to ask about this fake marriage. It's a very important time for them right now. But at that moment, Setia entered the room without knocking. When she saw that they were talking, she apologized and said that she did not want to interrupt them. Emil immediately jumped up from her seat and said they were already done, so she didn't interrupt anyone. He started running towards the girl, asking if it was lunchtime and they could head to the dining hall. But then, for some reason, he couldn't keep himself on his feet and started to fall. Karen immediately picked it up, but then he whispered in the aide's ear to leave immediately. The guy, like a robot, replied that he was leaving right away, and without even turning back, went. Setia at this point ran up to her husband and asked if he was okay. The man replied that he was fine, as it often happens, and said that now they could go to lunch. After a while, they were already sitting at the table, which was completely filled with various foods. There were appetizers, salads, and a main course. Setia tasted what she had on her plate, thought it was just a salad, but the dressing was very tangy and refreshing, and decided that the cook probably had her own secret recipe. But she realized that not only the salad, but the entire meal had been very carefully prepared using a technique perfected over the years. Setia liked this food much better than what she had eaten at the Halogen Manor, let alone the academy. And while she was eating, for some reason Emil came up to her and very close to her. The girl was very surprised and asked, "What's wrong?" Emil started to reach a hand toward her face and told her to wait a moment. Afterward, he wiped what was left next to her lip from the food she had just eaten. Then he licked what was left on his finger and said she had soup on her lips. Setia thanked him and thought to herself, "Did you really have to lick it off like that? You could have just wiped it off on a napkin." Well then, the guy smiled and said he would be very happy to do it again in the future. At that moment, the girl thought that perhaps Count Lunario was a bigger lecher than she had thought. After that, the girl sat in the office and studied the documents. They were a complete mess. She couldn't understand how he had only managed to get into the academy. At that moment, she shifted her gaze to a stack of papers that lay nearby, and thought that either way she was finally free of her so-called family. These words gave her goosebumps, but she was not sure whether she was glad or not, because on the one hand she was free, and on the other hand she was in an unknown place with an unknown man. But her thoughts didn't last long, for she had to get back to work. The sun was beginning to set outside the window, and she was looking at another document. Suddenly someone knocked on her room, and after that he immediately came in and called her his mistress. Setia immediately looked up and saw her husband in front of her, with some girl standing next to him. Miel explained that she would be her personal maid from now on. The girl smiled and said her name was Rani Sonar and she would now be at her service. But she also asked that mistress call her by her first name. Setia was surprised because this girl looked very young and she didn't know if she was old enough to work. At this point, Miel turned to mistress and suggested that they go to the garden, because she had been lost behind books for the past few days, and a little fresh air would do her good. For the girl, the offer was a bit unexpected, and her husband stood looking at her the whole time until she answered. Setia was a little uncomfortable, but she still gave in under his pleading and said okay. When they left the room, the girl thought that after all, Kondrad included the condition that they should look in love, and after a while, the guy held out his hand for her to take hold of. Setia was surprised. For a while she just stood there looking at him. But then she realized that apparently he really did want them to play their parts. So the girl simply had no choice but to take his hand, and so they went on their way. Setia was a little embarrassed. She had never held hands with a man before, and his hand was still big and very warm. It was even too warm. But the girl decided to ignore it, and they went into the garden. As soon as they entered, Setia at the entrance immediately saw the beautiful flowers that were blooming. They smelled all over the greenhouse and were bright yellow in color. The girl was very surprised. She said they were wildflowers. Did he really grow them himself? The guy said of course not, but he left them in his garden because they are very beautiful. So he thinks it's okay to consider them part of his garden. At this moment, she thought that none of the nobles would do such a thing. It was strange to her. Most people in the know would scold their gardener for wildflowers in their garden, for it is not a sign of wealth, but rather of some kind of poverty. Other high-status people would just take the gardener out. That's the best-case scenario. Then they walked a little farther. Those wildflowers were there too. Setia crouched down to get a better look at them and asked if he knew their name. Miel came closer to her and sitting down next to her, she replied that many people call them sunset flowers. He explained that they have that name because they start blooming when the sun is just setting and close at the very dawn. Setia was very surprised when she heard this information and said it was quite strange. Miel said maybe, but then added that since it was still winter, would she like to see the vegetable garden? The girl agreed and said sure, why not? Paris said he didn't even know she was so interested in the plant, and afterwards he added that they have vegetables that yield even in cold weather. After a while they walked around the greenhouse and vegetable garden and came to a small table to have tea. Miel, as soon as they sat down, told the lady that he was going to the royal palace the next day to meet with the crown prince. He would be staying there overnight, so he asked that she take care of the manor while he was gone. Setia, of course, agreed and said that she would fulfill that no problem, and wished him a safe journey. For a while they sat in silence and just drank tea. Then Miel smiled, looked his mistress straight in the eyes, and thanked her for agreeing to be his wife. It was a surprise to the girl, and she asked why he suddenly started talking like that. But the man replied that he had been thinking about this decision all last month, so he was absolutely sure of his actions and words. After that, the girl headed back to her office and began to continue sorting through the papers. Examining one of the documents, she noticed that all the calculations were wrong, but somehow the total was calculated correctly. Apparently, he was too lucky. But then she realized that if he was really lucky, he wouldn't have failed his academy exams. Then she shifted her gaze to the other side of the table and smiled. On the edge of her desk, next to her textbooks, she had a pot of flowers. They were the wildflowers of the sunset, Meal gave them to her and said he hoped the flowers would lift her spirits while she worked. The more Setya looked at them, the more questions arose. She still couldn't understand why these flowers bloomed at night when no one could see them. They become so wonderful, but then what's the point if no one can appreciate their beauty? But then she realized that at the same time there must be people such as Count Lunaria who would appreciate the beauty of these flowers after all. When night came, they lay down in the shared bed again. Satya fell asleep quite quickly, because she was very tired while she was working. But Meal got out of bed at the first good opportunity, walked around her and stopped at Satya's side. For a while he just stood there and watched her peacefully sleeping, not even suspecting anything, flying around in her dream world. But after that, he quickly turned around, slipped his cloak over his shoulders, and started to walk away, thinking that he was sure this wouldn't be their last goodbye. In the morning, as the carriage pulled up to the manor, the man stood beside it, and Satya stepped out to escort him out. Meal casually said that this was the first time they were separating first of their marriage. At that moment, the girl noticed that it somehow sounded like they really were a real couple. But the boy looked at her pensive face and smiled. Afterward, he moved closer to her and kissed her on the cheek. Satya was surprised. She even felt a little embarrassed by this. Meal quickly pulled back and said that he would miss her. The girl got mad but tried to pitch me the video and told me it was only going to be gone for a day after all. As the Earl was about to enter the wagon, he turned to his wife and said he would try to return as soon as possible. But the girl smiled and said he shouldn't be in such a hurry. Let him just take care of himself and stay out of trouble. Meal smiled and said okay, he would do his best. Then he wanted to add something else, but changed his mind, got into the wagon and waved goodbye. When the carriage left, Satya thought it was just part of their contractual obligations, just a publicity stunt, and nothing more. But when she remembered how he had kissed her, she felt good. But her day flew by very quickly, because the girl had quite a lot of responsibilities both around the house and her work. She didn't even have time to think extra thoughts during the whole day, because she had really a lot of things to do. So she was busy until the evening. When it was already dark and there were many stars in the sky, the girl looked out the window. But her husband had not arrived. She was a little upset about this because she thought he would be back in time to work in his garden. She was beginning to worry if he was all right, because Meal had been delayed for quite some time. He'd promised to be back even sooner. But at that moment, a maid began to knock nervously in the room to the mistress and ask. The girl opened the door. Satya opened the door and saw a worried Rani in front of her and was starting to get nervous herself. So she immediately asked what was wrong. Rani turned to her mistress with frightened eyes and a trembling voice and told her that their master was in trouble. The maid had some sort of sheet in her hands, and when Satya read what was written there, she nearly fainted from the information she saw. The girl was in a panic. She wanted to run out in the middle of the night in just her nightie to save him, but of course no one would let her. When she recovered a little, the girl was told that he had been found dead, and they were pretty sure it was bandits. At that moment, Satya began to remember all of his words and phrases. And the first phrase she remembered was about roses, about them starting to bloom in late spring and blooming until early summer. And it was indeed so, because the beautiful roses in the garden began to bloom in May, and they didn't start getting their full color until June, exactly as Meal described to her. It had been quite some time since that fateful night. Satya sat in the gazebo drinking tea, as suddenly the girl remembered Meal's words, that he would like to have afternoon tea with her when the roses begin to bloom. It had been 3 years since the death of her fictitious husband, and in 9 months their prenup would be over. In all this long time, Satya had gotten used to looking at roses alone. Ever since he died, she still stuck to the pact. It was hard for her at first, but in time the pain went away. In fact, the kingdom of Che is located across the ocean, and Puhong is the port city of the kingdom. So one day Satya arrived in this very town with her maid, but then suddenly a man came up to her and bowed to her, then told her that a delegation from Al Yari had arrived to meet with her. Of course the girl went to this meeting. Before she went in, she saw several men standing guard. Satya immediately noticed that their clothing bore the crest of a royal knight. When she came closer, the knights bowed, and one of them said that the next emperor of Alari awaited her return. Satya was surprised when he said, "The next emperor." The man explained that there had been a coup d'etat. The girl immediately asked what exactly happened. Then the knight explained that the crown prince and the third prince had started a riot, and his highness had escaped in the midst of all this chaos. The first prince was able to defeat his brothers and eliminate those involved in this coup, and thus it was that the empress and princess were imprisoned for their participation in the rebellion. Setia was surprised to hear this news, because she never thought that the crown prince and the third prince would start a rebellion. She knows that they were not happy, but she had no idea that it was only a question of taxes. Then the girl turned to her maid and told her to pack their things, for they were leaving. And I thought about the fact that to some people it means nothing. But to someone who is involved, it can mean a lot. Sometime later, Setia arrived at the estate where a very important event was taking place. There were already a lot of guests in the ballroom. They were talking among themselves while waiting for the start. Then from above came down a priest and a young lad who was smartly dressed. In the priest's hands was a crown embroidered with various precious stones. The priest put this crown on the guy's head and told him to keep the protection of their god with him at all times, calling him Your Highness. Then people also began to repeat these words so that God's protection would be with him. At that moment, the guy turned around and addressed all the guests, saying that their god would protect Alari from enemies. He also said that his life was in danger even before the coup d'etat. The guests, upon hearing this, were shocked. However, the man went on and said that it was also about his mother, Canazia Lunaria, as well as her family, Count Lunaria. He also revealed that before his mother's death, the former Count and Countess Lunaria had been murdered by the former Empress, who had faked the whole thing as an accident. Setia, who was standing behind everyone and listening, was even shocked. However, Your Highness continued and said that not only Earl Meal's life was also in great danger, and at that moment a man came into the hall. He was covered, so it was impossible to see his face. When people saw him, they immediately began to whisper. And His Highness went on and said that his death was deliberately arranged to avoid assassination attempts. Setia, having heard this phrase, would not listen to the man any further. She thought that if the death was faked, it could only mean one thing. At that moment, His Highness said that he was proclaiming Count Lunaria as the new Duke of Alari. And at that moment, it was Meal who began to walk past the guests. Setia was in shock. She couldn't believe that all these years, as long as she had lived alone, Meal had been alive and well. Then the girl heard the whispers of the people, who could not believe what they heard, and had no doubt that it was indeed the same Count Lunaria. Setia thought that maybe she was asleep, and this would all be over as soon as she opened her eyes and morning came, because she couldn't believe that Count Lunaria was alive. After all, they held his funeral right after the girl learned of his death. It was a real ceremony, like a proper ceremony. The girl thought maybe God had given her this vivid dream to comfort her in her loss. But at that moment, Meal came closer and closer to the girl, and then she looked clearly at him, and their gazes met. But the boy saw some stranger standing next to Setia. He couldn't figure out who it was. He noticed the one smiling ceaselessly at Setia, and he didn't like him right away. However, Meal decided not to show any sign. He walked closer to His Highness and then stopped in front of him. Then the man nodded back at him, and they began to leave the banquet hall. At that moment, the girl was approached by the guy who was standing next to her. He looked very frightened. They first met 2 years ago in the Che Kingdom. The girl had a very unpleasant situation. He came over and asked if she was all right. Setia was very frightened. She couldn't say a word to him, so she just nodded. Then the boy said he was glad they had found her in time. Afterward, added that his servants had found what had been stolen from her. She had to watch not to be in the harbor, for the target of pickpockets was the purses of passers-by. Setia said she understood now, and explained that it was close so she wasn't as attentive, and thanked him for what he had done. The man smiled and said that he had done what anyone in his shoes would have done. And after that, he asked her what had brought her to the kingdom of Che. The girl turned and looked at him. She didn't bother to say her real reason, so she just smiled. Stranger, when he saw her beautiful facial features, his heart began to beat more frequently, and his breathing, on the contrary, slowed down. After a while they went into the building when the guy said she had no idea she had come to meet him. It was some even coincidence or perhaps fate. The man then added that he had heard about the roses on Lunaria's estate, and the rose candies she produces are selling out like hotcakes in Che. Then he folded his hands in a lock and looked at the girl and said that she was probably at his place that day to discuss business. Setia said that was right. They needed to bring more tourists to Lunaria, and she would like to team up with a group of traders from Cheya. The man, getting up from the table, replied that was fine. But in that case, he asked, why don't they visit the popular tourist spots in the city? He held out his hand to her. Setia hesitated for a moment, but put hers there. Then the guy and the girl began to visit various places that were very much loved by tourists. It took them quite a while, and they visited almost everywhere in the city. Sometime after their travels, this guy asked his assistant to find the information, and he did. The aide said that Count Lunaria had recently gone missing, and there was a rumor that he had died at the hands of bandits. He felt very sorry for poor Setia. He couldn't even imagine how she was going through all this. And one day, as they were walking around the city and solving important business matters, the girl's nose suddenly bled. The man immediately became alarmed. He asked if she was okay, handed her a tissue to wipe her nose. Setia replied that she was fine and there was nothing wrong with it. However, he insisted and said that she had overexerted herself recently. He asked if she had gone to take out the bandits herself. Setia turned away from him and said that she had already told him it was all right. The man just looked at her for a while with a pitying look. He was very worried about the girl's well-being, and afterward asked if she knew what the noble ladies called her, but without waiting for an answer, immediately said that they called her a worker ant, since everything she does is just work. He looked at the girl, who was still holding the handkerchief near her nose because it was bleeding, and told Setia that being healthy was part of her job too. The girl didn't say anything back to that, and the guy kept insisting and said that he would really like her to spend her time doing more than just work. He smiled and added that he just wanted true and bright happiness for her. And it was some time afterward that Setia and her maid were about to leave for home. They stood by the ship to leave. The man escorted them out. He wished them a safe trip and that they had no obstacles in their way. He also told her to rest, at least a little, on the way back. The girl said okay. However, he resented it and said that she always says that. He then turned to Rani and told her to make sure that Setia was properly rested. The maid replied that he could not worry and rely on her. She would do everything. Setia already wanted to enter her ship. However, the boy called Roinus grabbed her arm, then pulled her closer to him and, taking her hair out of her face with his hand, said that he hoped it would make her think of him. At that moment, Setia heard someone calling her. Then the girl opened her eyes and saw Roinus in front of her. However, it was a different location. The girl did not immediately realize that she had fallen into her memories. But the man looked at her with a slightly crazy look and said that they were going to have tea, weren't they? He then added for them to go, for they had just gotten a brew of the finest tea leaves. The girl was still in shock at everything. Roinus just stared at the girl for a while. Afterward, he said that she had only been with him a month after all. The guy lowered his eyes and said that he had been at her side for 2 years now after all. He asked that she choose him. Roinus was ready to beg her to do so, but the girl herself did not know what to do. The guy thought about what he'd said to her, and he was sure he had at least a small, but not insignificant chance that she'd stay with him. Setia thought about the month she'd spent with Mil, the joyful moments they'd shared. The guy had given her the motivation to live life to the fullest. At that moment, someone approached them. It was Mil. He looked at the girl and called her his mistress, as he had done before. For a while, they just stood there looking at each other, smiling. After that, Setia turned to Roinus and said they would have tea another time, apologizing. The man was very offended by this, but he held back. So he smiled and said sure. He also added that if she wanted to meet him, she should send a message to the Margaritka Hotel. After that, Roinus bowed to them and began to walk away. Setia and her husband, who until that moment had been presumed dead, just stood there silent. Then she suggested they go home, and there they could talk. Mil agreed, and then they went outside, heading for the wagon. When they came to the wagon, the assistant was sitting there. He immediately looked at the lady and was very surprised, for he immediately saw his master beside the girl. The boy immediately ran up to his master and hugged him very hard, sobbing happily. Mil angrily told the man to let him go if life was precious. The boy immediately let him go and got on his horse. Then the boy and the girl also got into the wagon and went on their way. They sat there and did not even look at each other, but just kept silent and thought about their own things. After a while, Setya spoke first. She turned to the master and asked, what really happened after all? The girl became embarrassed and said that he had told her in the beginning that he would treat her with respect, as if she were his real wife. She even started twisting her fingers because of her excitement, and summarized by saying that he was obligated to let her know he was alive. She of course understands all about their marriage being a sham, but it was still very ugly of him. Setya thought that he had no idea how much she had felt about his death. She wondered if she was the only one who took the relationship seriously, and he didn't care. But the man remained silent all this time. Then the girl couldn't stand it anymore. She looked at him and said that if he wanted to say something, let him say it, looking directly into his eyes. She even hit him in the chest with her fist out of anger. However, Miel didn't say anything to that either. She let her eyes down and just sat there. Setya felt hurt, and she couldn't stand it any longer and said that he was a very bad man. The girl's whole body began to shake with anger and worry. She stopped looking at him and lowered her voice to say that he told her one thing and ended up doing something completely different. He is a terrible and irresponsible man. He brought the girl into this sham marriage and then left her to her fate without even explaining anything, and just disappeared without a trace. Miel apologized in a very quiet voice. He made a fist because he was uncomfortable. In fact, he couldn't tell them he was alive, no matter how much he wanted to. He wanted it all at once. Revenge and Setya. During the month they had been together, he had wanted to influence her. If he died on the path of vengeance, he wanted to live on in her memories. He wanted her to remember his name. Certainly he wanted the girl to remember Miel Lunarius. But really, he couldn't imagine that she would be devastated by his death, because he thought she couldn't get that attached. As soon as his funeral was over, his secret agents came and said that his mistress was barely hanging on during the whole funeral. That really shocked the guy. There was no way Miel could believe that she would suffer so much for someone like him. He looked away and apologized once more. The boy apologized sincerely to his mistress. However, he said he simply had no other choice to avenge his family, and he didn't want to put the girl in danger at all, so he didn't say anything. Now Setya just sat and listened to him, saying nothing. Then he looked directly at her and said that he apologized for making her suffer. The day would come when he could tell her what had really happened and why he had done it. Setya sighed heavily. After that, she looked out the window and said that she wasn't suffering, just mentally exhausted. But at that moment the girl heard some strange rustling. Then she immediately turned her gaze to Miel. The guy felt very ashamed, so he even kneeled down in front of her and said that he was really apologizing. Setya wanted to say something to him. However, the guy interrupted her. He took her by the tip of her dress and begged for forgiveness. The girl was shocked by this, but she answered nothing. Then Miel looked her straight in the eyes with his pleading gaze and asked her not to leave him. He said he didn't know what he would do without her, so he really wanted her to stay. Setya addressed him, calling him Lord, and then asked if maybe she should call him your lordship. Then, after waiting for an answer, she said he wasn't very smart. Miel said right, so he asked her to never leave him. Setya sighed heavily and replied that she couldn't leave him even if she wanted to. The guy was genuinely surprised and asked what she meant by that. The girl explained that if she broke the contract before it expired, she would have to pay a fine. This is stipulated in their contract, which they drew up at the very beginning. At that moment, Miel remembered the clause that in the event of his death, Setya must fully honor the terms of the treaty and remain in her position as Countess of Lunaria for 4 years. The guy was immediately excited. He said he knew she could get a better job than this one. But Setya said no job was worth the fines she would have to pay if she violated their prenuptial agreement. Miel smiled and said that now he understood everything, and added that this article was a lifeline for him. Setya grew even more serious and said that she saw no reason to smile, for henceforth he was obliged to let her know where he was going, and let him be kind enough to let her know if he felt in danger. The girl said that she is his wife, even though it is only by contract. However, she believes that she has the right to know his whereabouts. The guy laughed and said that he gave her his word that he would fulfill all these requirements, but she went on and said that he should value her as if she were his real wife. so she hoped he would still show responsibility. When the girl was silent, Meal was still kneeling and holding onto her dress. She felt a little uncomfortable about it, so she turned to His Highness and told him to return to his seat. She had already forgotten how difficult it was with him. Meal was surprised and asked if she would let him. Setya replied that he could not kneel before her forever, but the boy said he would stay on his knees until she was better. But at that moment, the carriage sped up, and they got a pebble in the way, which caused it to sway violently and even tilted over a bit. Meal, who was still kneeling at this time, fell right on top of the girl. Satya got angry and told him to sit back in his seat because the servants would be shocked if they saw him sitting on his knees. The guy symbol next to her and said that's right. He hadn't even thought of that somehow. After that, they drove in silence. However, Meal decided to take the girl's hand, and he placed his warm, even slightly wet hand on hers. Satya looked out the window and said she didn't mean he was stupid, so she apologized. Meal looked at the girl and replied that it was okay, because he preferred her to be honest with him. The girl was surprised, and he said she agreed to be his wife knowing he was shallow, so he was very happy. Satya just stared at him in silence for a while. After that, she laughed and said that he was really something with something. The guy moved closer to them and said that he was very happy to see her smile again, because it made him happy. He also said that her smile is really beautiful, just like a work of art. Satya was shocked at such compliments, and she interrogated what he meant by that. The girl even felt embarrassed, but the guy went on, and he said she reminded him of a yellow rose in full bloom. The girl objected and said that was ridiculous, and asked him to stop saying such things. Then she changed the topic of conversation and asked where he had been all this time while he was declared dead. Meal replied that he was constantly moving from place to place. Satya replied that it all made sense now, and added that she was very glad that he wasn't hurt. The boy replied that he was also glad that he had come back alive. They looked at each other in silence for a while. After that, the boy asked if he could ask her a question. The girl said of course he could, and asked which one. Meal asked what kind of foreigner it was next to her at the coronation. Satya was surprised at such a question, but replied that he was a friend. This guy ran a trading company in the Chai kingdom. The guy replied that it was clear to him now, and also added that the two of them must be very close. The girl said they weren't that close. He was the head of the first trading company she traded with in Che. Meal said in a muffled voice that the guy addressed her by her first name, and they had such an informal conversation. That's why it seemed to him that they were close. She said it was because they were the same age. But the guy added that he even put his arm around her shoulders. Meal didn't feel good about this conversation. But then Satya explained that he was just helping her come to her senses after she saw that he was alive. The man replied, "I see." And then he looked out the window and saw his beautiful estate, where he had not been for a very long time. When they came out, they went straight to the garden because Meal wanted it so much. They walked around and there were lots of roses all around them. The guy said that their house in the capital also had a garden of blooming roses. Satya looked away and said that the estate was also at the peak of blooming of these beautiful flowers right now. Meal suddenly looked at her strangely, even with a manic look of some kind. It made the girl uncomfortable. She turned around and looked at him and asked, "What's wrong?" At that moment he held out his hand to her, and then he pulled her against his chest and began to hug her tightly. Satya was shocked by this. She didn't expect him to do that. The boy whispered in her ear that he really missed her a lot. He started to squeeze her even harder because he couldn't control his feelings. It was even hard for the girl to breathe. He squeezed her even tighter and asked if she missed him too. Satya answered, panting, that she couldn't breathe. Meal, freaking out, immediately let the girl go, and then said that he just got a little carried away, and apologized to the mistress for it. The girl sighed heavily and said that he was still just as full of energy. The boy was surprised and asked if she really thought so. At this point, the guy took one lock of her hair and, sniffing it, said that he thought he could now fulfill his nightly duties. Satya, hearing this, was shocked. She didn't understand what night duties meant. The girl didn't understand how he could even say such a thing, and with such a nonchalant face, as if it were nothing. She started to move away from him and said that of course she missed him too. He had disappeared so suddenly, without a trace. The girl wanted to leave, but Meal began to hug her again very tightly. The girl was in so much pain that she screamed again. She didn't understand what was even going on with him. Emil then asked how much. Setia wondered how much she missed him. In fact, she missed him so much that it couldn't even be described in words. But she answered him, averting her gaze, that she didn't even know. The guy still insisted and asked how much. Setia said that she had already told him that she didn't know. They walked on, and Emil told her not to be so mean to him. The girl then sighed and said, "Okay, so be it," she would, and replied that she missed him very much. The man smiled and asked if that meant she missed him a lot. Setia became even more serious and replied that when he appeared out of nowhere, she was discouraged and didn't even know how she should act in such a situation. The guy felt uncomfortable again for his actions, so he apologized to her again. At this time in the manor, the news was spreading everywhere. The aide, who as soon as he arrived immediately ran to the other knights and said that the master had already returned. People just couldn't believe it, and Setia's maid ran up to the others and told them that their master had been given the title of Duke. One of the maids said that sometimes dreams are so much like real dreams that you can really mix them up. Butler agreed and said that the fine line between dream and reality could be blurred, so Ronnie could easily get confused. But the girl got angry and shouted that she meant it. Then she suggested that they go and see for themselves, for their lord had returned as a duke. All the house staff could not believe this information, so they decided to go and see it with their own eyes. And so, when they were in the garden, they saw Emil beside Setia. They were just shocked, for they really couldn't believe that he had come back. They immediately started shouting and greeting His Highness. The guy immediately covered his ears from this balaganza because he even started to get a headache. Then he shouted to all the workers of the house and told them to be quiet, for he was about to lose his hearing because of them. The girl approached him and asked him caringly if he had a headache. Emil smiled and said that it hurt a little. So Setia turned to the workers and said that she understood how things should be. They are all happy to meet their master again, but as they can see, his lordship is in need of rest. So she asks that they all return to their duties. One of the knights immediately said that, of course, they wouldn't bother him anymore and would return to their duties. Then the servants immediately began to go about their business. When they were alone, Emil looked at the girl and smiled. He was pleased that she had stood up for him. But then, Setia told him to go straight to the bedroom. The boy was very surprised and asked why that was. And she told him to go and lie down for a while so that his head would go away. Emil replied that he was perfectly fine. But the girl said that he was left stronger than he could imagine, so he should rest for a while. The boy and the girl set off in the direction of the manor. When they got to the bedroom, Setia helped the boy take the cape off his shoulders. As she hung it on the rack, she thought that his style preference hadn't changed at all, and he was still the same. At that time, Emil had already gone to bed. The girl covered him with a blanket and told him that she would go back to work and that he would rest for now. The guy put his hand on hers. The girl, concerned, asked, "What's wrong?" Emil grabbed her arm as she tried to leave and asked if she had a lot more work to do. Setia replied that yes, she did. He looked at her with a pleading look and asked, "In that case, could I have her work in the bedroom?" Of course. And the girl couldn't resist that puppy dog look and said she'd bring the papers for now and let him lie there. After a while, the girl went to her office and from it brought a stack of books and documents she still needed to process. Then she put all her things on a small table that was nearby. Emil asked if the work was urgent. The girl, who had already sat down to study the documents, replied that the sooner it was finished, the better. The guy interjected, "Does that mean she doesn't have to do it right now?" The girl didn't know what to say to that. Setia turned the page and said she assumed that was what she was asking. "So why is he asking?" Emil replied that he only wanted to talk to her briefly. He lay back on his pillow and said he'd heard about how she was doing, but wanted to hear it directly from her himself. He looked at the girl and asked if it was possible to do so. Setia didn't know what to say to that. Well, then she lay down next to him in bed and still said okay, she'll tell him everything. Then the guy asked if she had dealt with the bandits because of him. Setia, hearing this, was shocked. She was even a little scared that she had been exposed. After a while, the girl replied that she thought they had taken his life, so she couldn't just let it go. Emil, summarizing, said it was revenge. The girl turned away from him and said that was right. That's what she thought at that moment. Afterward, the guy sat on the bed and said he was sorry for making her suffer and stay in the dark all these years. Setia replied that she had done what anyone would have done in her place, because the bandits had gotten completely out of hand. He looked questioningly at the girl, wondering if it was part of her duties or her own initiative out of resentment. Emil moved closer to her and told her that by doing his duties and taking down bandits in his absence, she had been so busy and so apologized for that. The girl replied that she understood, that he had no other choice, because his life was in danger, and in that case, it was either you or them. But still it was part of her job. Well then, she said it wasn't so bad after all because she was getting a lot of help. Emil sighed and said that she was getting a lot of help, which meant she was heavily loaded. He was truly sorry. Setia was very surprised because she heard some sobbing. Then she looked at the man who was sitting next to him and asked if he was crying. But the guy said it was probably an eyelash in his eye and he was in no way crying. The girl said that it was understandable then, and asked if he needed help. Emil, wiping his eyes, smiled and said it was fine. If you rub your eye well, it would come out easily and would not cause discomfort. Then he pointed to his finger where his eyelash lay, and said that here it was that he had managed to get it out. Setia was surprised and asked him if his long bangs were bothering him. The man, putting his glasses back on, replied that it did not. Then she added that she wanted to ask him something and, without waiting for permission, asked him why he had grown such a huge bangs that covered half of his face. Emil smiled then and said that was his style. The girl wasn't even surprised that the answer would be similar. Then, looking him over from head to toe, I wondered if he really thought it was stylish. The wrinkled shirt, the bangs that covered his entire face. Emil lowered his head and said in a muffled tone that he so understood she didn't like it, but the girl replied that she respected his preference. But then he asked what her preferences were. The girl didn't expect such a question, so she was caught off guard. Emil repeated her question, what her type might be, for example. She likes some kind of long hair. The girl replied that she didn't know, because she had never even thought about it. Then the boy asked her what she found attractive in men. Setia replied that she wasn't quite sure, and thought to herself that she knew exactly what she didn't find attractive for sure. Then I answered that she thought it was important to find what was right for you, and then everything would be fine, and you would live in harmony. Emil was overjoyed, and said that now he understood everything, and after that, he asked the mistress to tell him more about what happened when he disappeared. The girl replied that of course she would tell him everything, and the first factor was the status of his lands. Cecilia sat like that for a very long time and told everything. And so, when it was already quite dark night, Emil went into the hot bath to relax a little. After some time, which he spent in the warm and refreshing bath, the guy finally finished and got out, wrapping a towel around his hair to keep it from dripping on the floor. At this time, Setia, who had already finished with her work, was tidying herself up, sitting by the mirror. She also wiped her wet hair with a towel and applied cream to it. Emil walked past her, but the girl paid no attention to him. He went to bed then, and Setia turned around to say that his hair was still wet. The guy was very surprised and asked if they were really wet. He thought that everything was going right according to plan. At that moment, the girl thought that she couldn't ask him to undress in order to dry his hair. So with a heavy sigh, she stood up. She went over to him and asked him to sit down. She had a towel in her hands, which she was going to use to dry him. Emil was surprised and said she should dry her hair first, since his was almost dry and nothing would happen. But the girl objected. She lifted him off the bed and, shoving him under her back, told him to hurry up. Emil had no choice, so he walked over to the table and sat down at it. Then Setia carefully began to wipe his wet hair with a towel.